And perhaps the most insidious part of what has happened in the state of Maine has to do with education. The best example of that is since 1970, the amount of money we spend per student in the state of Maine in K-12 has increased by 400%. And in that same period of time, test scores have gone down. Where we were once well ahead of Massachusetts, we are now well behind Massachusetts. But I'm telling you these things because no one woke up 16, 8, 2 years ago, 20 years ago and said, let's make Maine a bad place for business. That was never anyone's intent. It does us absolutely no good to look at our existing politicians and condemn them for where we are. Ronald Reagan said quite eloquently when he was running for office that he took a pledge and he said, "Thou shalt not speak ill of your fellow Republicans." You will not hear me speak ill of any of my fellow Republicans or Democrats or Libertarians. There's no value in doing that. The value is to try to understand where we are and why we got to where we are, not blame anybody, but then make up our minds we're going to change these things. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to have a 5-point plan that's going to be really simple that we can follow for the next 8 to 10 years. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to reform taxes. And we're going to start with taxes because we all hate them. And we're going to start with taxes because the two most insidious taxes that we've got is the combination of the inheritance tax and the capital gains tax. Together, those two taxes amount to 18.5%. And if you've worked your entire life in the state of Maine, and you are going to die, so am I, we're all going to die, and you think about the fact that you've got children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren, and that the state of Maine is going to charge you an extra 10% that you wouldn't have to pay in Florida, and you'd like to make sure that your grandchildren or their children have the money to have a proper education, you may decide that going to Florida is going to pay for your entire family's education after you die. The second thing is if you worked your whole life to create an asset, I don't care whether it's an apartment building or a small business, and you go to sell it. If you sell it as a Maine resident, you will pay an extra 8.5% when you sell that business. If it's $1 million that you're going to get, that's $85,000 that goes to the state of Maine. If it's $500,000, it's $42,000. If it's $10 million, it's $850,000. If you happen to be Bob Bear and you went to the state of Maine and you wanted a permit to build what became New Hampshire Speedway in Maine, and you were told, "Mr. Bear, we might be able to get you a permit in 2 years," and New Hampshire said, "Mr. Bear, we will get you a permit in 60 days, Bob Bear went to New Hampshire. And 9 months after he had his permit, he had his first Winston Cup race. And 5 years later, he sold New Hampshire Motor Speedways for a reported $380 million, which all stayed in New Hampshire. So we not only didn't get the benefit of his profit to reinvest in other business in the state of Maine, we didn't get his taxes, we didn't get the ongoing revenue that came from the industry. But because we couldn't find a way for government to work for him, we lost his entire business. There's an even more recent example of how Maine has inhibited itself. When you look at the number of great people who come from the state of Maine who now live in a residence outside of Maine. Good people. George Mitchell, great Democrat, solved the crisis in Ireland, majority leader of the United States Senate, no longer a Maine resident. Ken Curtis, the father of the sales tax, no longer a Maine resident. Dick Dyke, owner of Bushnell Gun, moved to Nevada, sold his business to save the money, became a Nevada resident, then came back and now summers in Maine. The list is almost endless because we have found a way to drive people out of the state of Maine. So very quickly what we can do with taxes is we can reduce these taxes. And by the way, because the taxes are so insidious, nobody pays them anymore. We only collect $30 million out of the $15 billion state gross budget from the inheritance tax. So if it magically went from 10 to 8 to 6 to 4 to 2 to 0 over the next 5 years, we would hardly notice that amount of money wasn't coming in anymore. But think about all the people who then would not decide that they needed to move to Florida, who would keep their primary residences in Maine. And if we took the capital gains tax from 8.5% down to 4.5%, which or 3.5%, which is the average in New England, in that same 4 or 5 year period, we would eliminate the excuse for people to go away. If we created a risk pool in the state of Maine, opened the doors for competition, we would save $4,000 for each one of the laborers that was in the state of Maine. If we looked at our rules and regulations and say, why are we driving everybody out of the state of Maine with our rules and regulations? Why isn't government working to bring business in by being hospitable to people? We may have a change in environment. When I came to Maine in 1972, you could walk across the Androscoggin River in the summertime, because we had become horrible stewards of our natural resources. And literally, without trying to be dramatic, we were pillaging in the state of Maine. But 40 years later, we're not. 40 years later, we're growing almost 0.35 cords per acre. We have 10% more wood growing than we cut. But we basically chased the paper industry out of the state of Maine. So worldwide, there are being built 60 paper machines which are environmentally friendly all over the world. And the wonderful softwood fiber that takes a long time to grow, which is wonderful for making all specialty papers, are now being made elsewhere in the world. In Rumford, where I have been for the last 38 years, when I came here, there were 14 paper machines that were running. And number 15 got built, and it was a $250,000 expense, and I think it was the most expensive paper machine that ever been built in the state of Maine. In Rumford right now, out of those 15 paper machines, only 2 are running, number 13 and number 15. And New Page has no plans to build any more paper machines because they regard Maine as the least friendly place in the world if they can make paper. We did that to ourselves for what we thought were good reasons, but we don't have to stay there. We can make Maine friendly again to paper companies by changing our rules and regulations and inviting them in and being hospitable. With energy, we can switch to alternative energy. We can give people tax incentives. We can promote the use of alternative fuels. We can allow people to smart grid their homes. We can buy power at midnight when you can get it for 2 or 3 cents at a residential level and store it and use it in your home by heating a large hunk of hot water, or putting in a system that turns your washing machine on and your dryer on and all your appliances on in the middle of the night. And a couple of years from now, we'll all be charging our cars with power because we've decided that we're going to make electric cars, and this time we seem to be serious about it.